My name is Donald, and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've liked our content so far and enjoyed it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Rob Davies. Rob is the former Minister of Trade and Industry of South Africa, a former anti-apartheid activist, and a leading figure of the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. He recently wrote a book on his ideas and life called Towards a New Deal. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So Rob, I mentioned in the intro that you have an anti-apartheid background. Can you tell us a bit about that? Can you give us a summary of your experiences during that period?
Yes, I didn't come from a political family, so I had a rather conventional upbringing as a child. I went to boarding school and I came from a middle-class family. My father was in insurance, my mother was a homemaker. I became involved in politics when I went to university, Rhodes University. And I think the time when I started to become involved is quite important. It was the period between the smashing of the ANC underground, the arrest of the Rivonia trialists, and the incarceration of Nelson Mandela and the rest. And it was also the period before the revival of the trade union movement in the 1970s. So there was an extraordinary focus on student politics as one of the sort of most obvious, overt forms of opposition that was still around in the country. So I became involved during that period. Internationally, it was a time when student protests were taking place against the Vietnam War, when you had a near revolution in France with the Paris 68. And it was a time when I think that there was a feeling that student politics was perhaps more significant than it ended up being. And I became involved in that time and became involved in protest activity, which was easily and quickly curtailed. We ended up having a sit-in at Rhodes University, which was the second sit-in that there was in the history of South Africa. The first had been at the University of Cape Town, when the council intervened to stop the appointment of a black lecturer, Archie Mafeji, and it was about a week sit-in. And then we had a similar incident, although it was a white person, a progressive white person, who was barred from a position in the theology department at Rhodes. I got involved in a sit-in there. We were rusticated. We were suspended from the university. And I then become increasingly involved in analytical work, and also a little bit in some of, through a distant connection, some underground leafleting on behalf of the ANC. And then finally, I moved to, because I had a bad disciplinary record from Rhodes, I had difficulty in continuing my studies. I went abroad and I then became effectively an exile, joined the ANC in Mozambique, where I went after completing my doctorate from the University of Sussex. I went to Mozambique, worked in Mozambique at an extraordinary time and for an extraordinary pair of individuals. One was Ruth First, the very well-known anti-apartheid activist, who was the director of research at the center I worked at in Maputo. And the other was Aquino de Braganza, who was someone who had come originally from Goa, but was a leading figure in the anti-colonial struggles of the Lusophone countries. Both of them suffered violent deaths at the hands of Braganza in the plane crash with Samora Machel, and Ruth First.
And you also suffered. You also suffered, and I briefly skimmed through your book. A very interesting book, by the way, on Google Books. And you had a moment in Mozambique where you almost delivered an object which you weren't supposed to deliver, and that could have killed you, or it could have led to your capture.
Yes, I did a little bit of couriering. My main role for the ANC was in political work and analytical work. That was my main work for the ANC. But I did a little bit of couriering for the movement, and it meant generally driving vehicles to Swaziland and passing through the Renamo roadblocks and attacks that were taking place on the road from Maputo to the border at that stage. On one occasion, I said that I was asked to drive a Volkswagen Beetle, and then suddenly people came along and told me not to drive it, and they told me I wouldn't have got outside of the city of Maputo because whatever they'd packed in the wrong way and in the wrong place. I never asked what was packed. I just did what I was asked to do.
Okay, so I mentioned in the intro that you're a member of the Communist Party. Do you consider yourself a communist, as what is traditionally known? And what do you see communism's role in modern society?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by as traditionally known. Yes, I consider myself to be a communist. I am still a member of the Central Committee and the Political Bureau of the South African Communist Party. I believe that Marxism, the corpus of analysis of Marxism, offers the best way of analyzing important trends in the capitalist order that we are living in today. And it is demonstrating to us, I think, the factors and reasons that underlie the periodic crises that this order that we're in experiences, as well as the tendencies towards widening inequality and towards a situation in which many of the ordinary working people and the poor are finding it increasingly difficult to march towards a better life. So I believe that it offers that in place. Having said that, I think that it's very clear that the experience that we had of Eastern European version of communism didn't achieve what I think the original founders of Marxism would have thought what should have been achieved. I think there are many reasons that one can analyze for that, but I think one of them which we have internalized in the SACP is that there was a growing distance between the leadership and the people, and that systems like one-party states and a lack of political competition was actually something that ended up stifling the socialist project. So I think that we're not seeking to try to create anything of the order of that we saw in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union in the past. I think we're looking to a very different future. I think also that the world has changed quite significantly. We're in a much more globalized world order. And I think that right now, what is very important is for a group of an alliance of progressive forces, not only communists, but other progressive forces and socialists, to actually be looking to an alternative that is much less divisive than the outcome which has been achieved through the neoliberal globalization that we've gone through since 1980s and 1990s.
So you would consider yourself more of a social democrat than a communist, or am I interpreting that wrongly?
I think that social democracy has also changed from what it used to be, and social democracy is now really often the phrase that would be applied to rather orthodox capitalist policies pursued by labor-type parties that originally had a socialist agenda. So I wouldn't want to say that I'm in that mold. But I would want to say that I do believe that the future has to be one in which the policies that we are pursuing in our own country, but also globally, are ones where people are put before profits. And the world that we are in is one where profits are put before people. And I think we can see the outcomes of that, even in the way in which vaccines are being distributed around the world. Not to mention the way in which inequality has reached the kind of levels now where a few $100 billionaires control as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. So I think this has been the outcome of free market capitalism. And what we need in place is we need, I think, a set of policies and systems and structures that seek to change that in a direction that is more conducive to the interests of working people and the poor.
Okay, so let's move to President Mbeki. As I believe you were the Deputy Minister of Trade and Industry during some period of his tenure. Do you believe that his presidency was an economic success? And if it is, how do we regain that glory?
No, I think that it was only a success in terms of some measures. It was a success in terms of GDP growth was somewhat higher than it had been before or since. But then I think also the world economy was a little bit different. We hadn't had, by the time before President Mbeki left office, before the onset of the Great Recession. And I think that where I worked in the DTI, even as a deputy minister, was essentially on the industrial policy. And when we looked at the significance of industrial policy, I think that the real lesson of economic history is that all countries that have transitioned from being underdeveloped to developed, or from poor to rich, have gone through a phase in which they have moved from into higher value-added activities, and they've done this through an industrial policy. And if we look closely at the growth path that South Africa was on during the presidency of President Mbeki, it was one where sectors like finance, wholesale and retail, trade, and other kinds of business services were growing at twice the rate of the productive sectors of the economy, agriculture, mining, and manufacturing. And I think that showed a deep structural weakness in the economy, which during my time as a minister as well, we also tried to put in place a more effective industrial policy to try to deal with that issue, bearing in mind the fact that the reason that poor countries stay poor is because they are simply producers and exporters of some or other primary product, consumers of other products. We'd undergone a significant deindustrialization with the onset of globalization. Our apartheid rulers deemed us to be a developed country during the Uruguay round. We took tariff cuts which were much steeper than those of countries like Brazil and India. We then made a virtue out of necessity by driving the tariff reductions even further in the hope that the industries would become more competitive. Many of them didn't become more competitive. Many of them just ceased to exist. And so we ended up having a premature deindustrialization. So I don't think that I would want to say that all was well in that particular period. But of course, then we went into a period, particularly the latter part of the decade that followed, where we were overwhelmed by state capture and corruption, which I think really has had incredibly damaging effects, not just in terms of the loss of revenue and the looting of resources, but also the damage to many public institutions, which are critical to us putting ourselves onto a more sustainable and more effective developmental path.
So you mentioned, just quickly before we move on to state capture, but industrialization. Do you believe that isn't that just a natural cycle with modern times, that the industrial sector is slowly moving away? And that's a global cycle that's production, I don't know, the practical creation of cars, whatever, those sectors are just naturally going away. There's no way of getting that back.
Well, I think actually what happened was that kind of thesis was used to explain a phenomenon that occurred during the phase of globalization called financialization, where we had the financial systems became primus inter pares within economies around the world. In South Africa, we had a growth of the financial sector from about 6.5% of GDP in 1994 to something approaching 20% by 2009. Much of this activity, as I think we found out during the Great Recession of 2008, was speculative in nature, was insufficiently regulated, and far from adding to wealth of countries, was actually extracting wealth from other sectors and recycling it into speculative casino-type operations that were really not developing economies anyway. And I think that since then, we've found that countries in the developed world that renounced industrial policy and said they'd moved into a post-industrial world, and it didn't matter if the manufacturing sector went belly up, are ruining the day they did that, because some countries like Germany, which are more successful, never did that. And those that allowed this to happen are now all trying to regain industrial capacity. And I think that this is something that is critically important. China is the big success story. It industrialized during this period, industrialized not by following the policy prescripts that were being directed at developing countries, but by following its own path, and it's emerged as a successful industrial country. And it's this, above all, that has enabled hundreds of millions of people to be pulled out of poverty in that country, and for China to emerge as the world's second largest, soon to be the largest economy in the world.
So if I can almost use an analogy, Bitcoin would be a typical analogy of almost like a financial sector object. There's a lot of speculation, but there's no real productivity there. So that's probably towards what you're trying to say. But just paraphrasing what you're saying. But if we move on to state capture, what is your opinion on President Zuma, his character, and the criminal charges now that he's now facing?
Well, I think that President Zuma will have to answer the criminal charges himself. It's up to him. I think that none of us wanted to work for President Zuma, or decided we wanted to work for President Zuma because we were happy with the idea that he may be involved in criminal activity. If he was, he will have to answer for that.
Sorry, Rob, can you tell us who is us?
Well, I think that there were quite a number of us that, I suppose I'm saying those of us in the South African Communist Party that became part of his government.
Blade Nsimande?
He, among others. I think we all became part of the government and the administration because we thought that there would be a possibility of a more progressive alternative emerging. And when we saw the evidence beginning to strike us that, in fact, there was extensive corruption taking place, and that this extensive corruption was extremely damaging, we became very concerned as to what was happening. And eventually the South African Communist Party, we called much earlier than others for his removal from power, because we thought that he was an obstacle to trying to rectify the situation. But whatever his own personal role in this, I don't know. I'm not an investigator. I read all the allegations, but I don't know what his own personal role is and whether he's guilty of anything in a personal capacity or not. But what I do know is that institutions like many of the public utility state-owned corporations were significantly damaged by loss of revenue, by undertaking dodgy contracts. All of those dodgy contracts had as a feature that they prioritized the acquisition of imports over locally produced products. They undermined the industrialization policy tool of localization. We also had things like black industrialists that we had been supporting as a DTI, and they had started to produce inputs for infrastructure procurement. They lost their work because it was replaced by some import coming from some dodgy tender. We saw that this was all happening and impacting negatively, not to mention the fact that we moved from a country of cheap, reliable power within a decade to becoming one of expensive and unreliable power, which was undermining our capacity to industrialize. And then there were things like the so-called shenanigans in SARS, which meant that our vigilance at borders was reduced, and we saw under-invoicing, which we had begun to counteract through various measures. We found it coming back with a bang in the 2017-2018 period. So that was my experience of state capture and corruption, that it was undermining the industrial policy that we were trying to put in place, and that there were too many people in too many places that were involved in it in one way or another, or alleged to be involved in it.
Did you ever bring up this subject in a cabinet meeting or to him directly, or the members of the Communist Party? Did you confront him on these issues?
We did. I wrote in the book, I kept saying that we are seeing that localization is not being observed. And my colleague Lynn Brown arranged for me to have a meeting with the then head of Transnet, Siyabonga Gama, and he started explaining to me, well, the localization designations had been too vague, and they hadn't said that the same thing needs to be localized by all the different tenderers, and so that some of them were doing some things and others were doing other things. So while taking that point, I also felt there was more to it. And so I encouraged the portfolio committee to conduct its own investigation into this. And when they came up with allegations and so on, I was, happy to be a bit of a megaphone for their views and raise these concerns. I think that's essentially what I can say is what I was doing during that time. Eventually, outside in civil society, when we started to see the Gupta tapes and the papers and all of that, then it became something that was becoming overwhelmingly significant that we couldn't ignore. And I record in my book that the now first Deputy General Secretary of the South African Communist Party, Mapaila, had spoke out in a large gathering of alliance, and said that the elephant in the room is the Gupta family, and we have to deal with this. So I think that's kind of the way some of us tried to take some of these issues on board. But it was a concern that we weren't able to achieve what I think we hoped we could achieve through, for example, industrial policy.
So we spoke to former ANC MP Nick Koranov, who said that he voted to remove President Zuma in a motion of no confidence. I know you're not comfortable with disclosing your vote, but can you tell us what was the general atmosphere like, or any interesting stories related to these events? Because I think there were like 8 motions of no confidence, plenty of motions of no confidence.
Well, I think the only one where there were significant numbers of people from the ruling party that voted for the motion was the one where there was a secret ballot. And I think my view is that it was a secret ballot, and I think that disclosure by individuals is not what I think is the appropriate way forward, which is why I don't really want to say my own view. But I do want to say that there were different people that had different motives in reaching such a decision, and there were other people who had as much concern, but felt that voting with an opposition motion was a bridge too far for them. So I think that by that time there was a real concern. I think many of the people who decided to vote for the motion decided that if it looked like it had been in all the previous motions, that the majority did not reflect a significant unhappiness within the ANC, that it would be seen as a bit of a victory for the forces of state capture and corruption. And therefore, I think that some people felt that it was necessary to take the step that Nick Koranov said he took, and others also took. And that was something I think that was also part of the process of understanding that we needed to have a change, and that we needed to move into a cleanup of the ruling party, and also a cleanup of the state institutions, and a decisive break away from the kind of practices that had given rise to state capture and corruption. And I think also then supported the idea that the Zondo Commission should be activated and should meet according to the mandate in the Public Protector's report. There were all sorts of other views that it should look at state capture, going right back, what had happened during the apartheid period and everything. And I think that was a deflection. And so many of us insisted, no, it must just follow the mandate as in the Public Protector's report and do the work which it's been doing over the last, whatever it is, 2 to 3 years.
I might be wrong here, but I believe Julius Malema was fairly confident that that vote could succeed. And that a lot of people, like you mentioned now, did not feel comfortable with voting with the opposition. Do you believe, if that was not a factor, that he could have been removed? That it's just because they were not confident with the opposition that they did not vote against with the motion of no confidence?
Well, it's impossible to say. I mean, I know there were people who were uncomfortable and unhappy with what was going on, but felt they couldn't make that move themselves. But it was a secret ballot. I don't know how many. It's impossible for me to say whether the numbers were there or not. But it was certainly an indication that there were quite a significant number of ANC members of parliament that had defied the message that we were all given, that we should not vote with the opposition, that we should in the secret ballot we should vote down the motion.
So I think this is a curiosity to many South Africans. What are cabinet meetings like? Because how many ministers do we have now? I think about 4,000.
No, I don't know the numbers now, but
that's probably 50 or 40.
Yeah, they're quite big meetings.
Does it occur in like what do you call it? A square table, a big square table room, and then everyone talks to each other across the square table?
No, actually, it's round. There's a round room in the Union Buildings where meetings are held in Tshwane, and there's a sort of there's two long tables in Cape Town, in the Tenure. That's where the meetings are held. So it's I think that's been the way it's been even before the democratic order, actually. And you have cabinet committees as well. 1 week it's cabinet committees, 1 week it's cabinet. And the cabinet committees, they're different cabinet committees, and what they do is they process what are called cabinet memoranda, which are tabled by individual government departments. And they can be either to support a legislative proposal or to develop some policy paper or to report on some international engagement of some sort and the outcome and the position to be taken. Those are the sort of issues that come up. And then the cabinet itself receives reports from those committees and endorses the decisions that are recommended by the committees. The cabinet also deals with other matters that are seen to be urgent enough to go straight to cabinet. President Ramaphosa introduced a new one where there were matters introduced by the presidency. The cabinet also deals with current affairs matters. And it depends on who you are as a minister, what items are coming up, whether you are bringing a memo or not. But you can also comment on other people's memos and that's the way the cabinet system works. I think it's fairly similar to the cabinet system in many other countries.
And a lot of South Africans believe that the bureaucracy is too big. There are too many ministers. Do you feel that these cabinet meetings are generally efficient and well orchestrated?
Well, I think the question of the size of the administration is another question. I don't think that the question of the size of the administration is a problem because there are too many people in a cabinet meeting. I think it's much more the expense of running so many offices and having so many different directors general and ministers drawing salaries and all that. That's much more the issue about streamlining the size of the state. But I do think that there's a balance to be struck between trying to get economies of scale, and also making sure that some of these departments don't become so overwhelmingly large that the minister or director general.
Would you be in favor of streamlining this cabinet, this particular cabinet, South African cabinet?
Well, there is a process that's going on. It's been looking at this, and some things have happened, and I think that I don't disagree with those things that have happened. But as I'm saying, there's a balance to be struck because if you have a very large department, then the ability of a minister or even a minister plus a DG to influence the direction is that much limited because you're running a huge bureaucracy, and I think that can be a sort of a recipe for stultification. So it's a balance that has to be struck between a size that allows effective administration and political leadership, but also allows for economy and not wasting money on over large bureaucracy.
So you were the Minister of Trade and Industry. So in reference to your ministry, do you believe that South Africa's tariffs hurt or aid a country? And would you see more taxes, duties, tariffs on foreign goods or less?
Well, in my time, we changed tariff policy. And tariff policy before had operated on a sort of a tacit mandate that tariffs could be reduced, but they could never be increased. And we then said, no, tariffs need to be influenced by the needs of industrial policy. That doesn't necessarily mean high or low tariffs. Evidence needs to be presented. But if evidence can show that through a raising of a tariff, we can expand domestic production or defend domestic production, that there are other processes in place to raise competitiveness of the industries concerned, those tariff increases could be justified. But tariff decreases could also be justified if they are large monopoly corporations dominating upstream to the detriment of downstream more labor-absorbing industry. So we said that it's an evidence-based process. So I think that is really the way. I don't think there's a blanket answer that can be given one way or the other. We need to have an evidence-based approach, but we also need to avoid and resist the sort of ideology of neoliberalism which was around, which basically said tariffs must all be reduced everywhere. Because I think that the evidence of economic history is that everyone who's industrialized has used tariffs to support nascent industries as they were emerging and developing. As those industries became competitive, then the tariff protection was no longer necessary. And many of them who had used, if you want, protectionism as they were developing, suddenly become preachers of free trade when they are developed, to the point where, as the 19th century German economist Friedrich List said, kicking away the ladder, denying others the opportunities to use the very same policy tools that they used in their own industrialization. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need to avoid, and we need to claim the policy space to set our own tariffs in our own way and in our own interests.
Yeah, this is interesting. It would be interesting to hear, do you then sort of agree with Donald Trump's trade policy, his trade tariffs that he initiated against China, for example?
No, I don't, actually, and also against us. They introduced, there were tariffs that were introduced on steel and aluminium products from South Africa as part of the so-called tariff wars. There were some real problems there. They were discriminatory. We were affected, but other countries that were seen to be closer to the US, like countries in South America, were not subject to the same tariffs, even though we were in a like situation. I think also that Donald Trump's tariff wars with China were to try to ward off China's competitive challenge. Countries are encouraged to develop, but if they ever pose any kind of competitive challenge, then that gets choked off by retaliation. So no, I think that there's a difference between the judicious use of tariffs and other measures as part of an industrial policy to develop and create higher value-added activities, and the kind of throwing the toys out of the cot that we saw when China became a significant competitor to the United States as a result of its industrialization, and particularly as a result of its decisions to become a significant player in the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution.
So he was basically just being a bully. He was using tariffs just to subvert nations that wasn't necessarily helping the United States.
Well, I think that's become a reality, and I think that reality has continued in the sense that what we see and started to see during the Trump time, that I think is also still continuing, and not just in the United States, is what I call a bit of a bipolar disorder, where we see policy tools are being used and claimed by the developed world for its own interests, but are decisively not preached to the rest of us. So, there's one law for them and another law for us. And I think that, for example, localization, we often hear that we should not be conducting localization policies. We should be opening ourselves up to global trade and best supply.
Sorry, if I can just quickly ask, what do you mean by localization? Is it federalism? What do you precisely mean with that?
No. Localization would mean that you turn around and you say that when we as government are going to procure something, or when one of the state-owned companies is going to procure something, we will insist that X% of it must be produced by South African domicile companies, not necessarily South African owned, but South African domicile. And these policies are widely used. For many, many years in the United States, for example, they have a Buy America Act, which prescribes that all the inputs into the Amtrak rail company, they all have to not just be manufactured, but also mined in the United States. Now, that's not a policy that's recommended to the rest of us. And I think that's an example of the sort of bipolar disorder that I think we're seeing in international trade. What's being practiced is not being preached. What's being preached is not being practiced. I think that's something that we need to learn and defend our space accordingly.
So what is your opinion on the recently signed African Continental Free Trade Area?
Well, I'm broadly in support of it. A lot of it was being negotiated at the time when I was a minister. And also, I think we were very much part of, during my time, of the debates which were basically reaching a conclusion that the next phase of African integration should not be to try to deepen integration in our own regional communities. In other words, to turn something like SADC from a free trade area into a customs union and a monetary union and so on. But the next phase ought to be to broaden integration at the free trade area level across the continent. And some of us, I think that the real prize of the continental free trade area will not be that it just increases intra-regional trade, although that's what it needs to do, but that it will allow the emergence of regional value chains, which will support a move to higher value-added production on a broad basis across the continent. Well, in other words, be a tool to support the continent industrializing. That's what we think is the real prize of the continental free trade area. To achieve that, it's going to be necessary, and I know that I even participate sometimes myself now. Research institutions are engaged in discussions across the continent, together with industrialists and trade unionists, about the policies that will be required to put in place the regional value chains in, for example, the pharmaceutical sector, where we know we can no longer afford to be dependent on imported vaccines, personal protective equipment, and other pharmaceutical products. In the auto sector, in agro-processing, in inputs into in infrastructure projects, clothing and textiles, and other sectors. And I think some work is going on around this. And if the African Continental Free Trade Area offers a real benefit to productive activity located in the African continent, it can become a real spur towards continental industrialization through the emergence of regional value chains.
So one of the fiercest, I don't know if it's the correct word to say criticism, but the reason why they say the African continental free trade area would not be as successful as a result of infrastructure, which is fairly low key in Africa. There's not the sufficient railways, roads, airway travel. They say it's because of that free trade would largely be hampered. Do you also think that really infrastructure is really something that needs to be upgraded in Africa in general?
Yes, I'm a strong supporter of what's called developmental integration. We want to say that the barriers to inter-regional trade are much less tariffs than they are real economy constraints and the lack of infrastructure. The real economy constraints means that if you're a producer and exporter of copper, and the next door country is a producer and exporter of iron ore, you don't have much to trade with each other. So diversification of production is the first thing. Secondly, if the infrastructure is the same old colonial infrastructure that takes the product from the mine to the port and then out of the continent, but doesn't link up the two countries one to another, then the trade will be hampered between the two. So yes, I think that the imperative is for the regional value chains to also address the infrastructure constraints. There is a program called PIDA, the Program of Infrastructure Development in Africa. I don't think it's made sufficient progress, but it needs to be given a strong push as the continental free trade area unfolds.
So I believe we covered probably quite a few subjects of your book, but is there anything that we've left out that your book Towards a New Deal also focuses on that's quite relevant to this discussion?
Well, I do. Basically, I say that this is a memoir, not a autobiography. So it's basically much of it is about the sort of economic history of the period after 1994 and some of the policy debates and issues. But I do think that we are finding ourselves in a situation now where the COVID lockdown has created enormous damage to our economy, along with many others. We had a 7% decline in contraction, economic contraction last year. And what this means is it means that we won't end up with the level of GDP of 2019 any time before 2023. And the 2023 target date is the Reserve Bank is dependent on fairly significant levels of growth off a smaller base in this year and next year. And then I think there's some real slippages with unemployment, which is stubbornly much higher and is not going down automatically as production recovers from COVID. We've got changes in behavior that I think are going to take a long time to change, if ever they do. The use of devices like the device we're using now, the use of online shopping and stuff like that, working from home, and all of these changes, which I think are going to mean that many people in low skilled service jobs are going to find those jobs have disappeared permanently. And then we've got half our population already in poverty, and then something like, according to a UNDP study, something between 288,000 households and 390,000 households that went further into poverty as a result of the COVID lockdown. And then inequality on an enormous scale, where the most recent figure I saw said 10% of the richest people in our country own 86% of the wealth, and the richest 3,500 people own 15%, which is more than the bottom 90%. So we've got tremendous inequality, poverty, and unemployment. And I think that we need a very, very active recovery program. And I try to outline some of this, what I think needs to happen in the last chapter of my book, and also express the concern that I think has been held back by the adoption bit by bit of austerity and the failure to use some of the non-conventional measures which are even being undertaken in the United States now under the Biden administration, which means that countries like the United States are deploying between 20 and 25% of their GDP to support recovery programs. So I think that that's another theme that I do take up in the book, as well as I think provide a number of accounts of events and developments that I think affected our transition to democracy in South Africa. A big focus of my attention has been, as someone who was in exile for many years, living in Mozambique, is on the regional dimension of the struggle against apartheid, and also the imperatives for us to see ourselves as part of an African continent and a Southern African region, and that our future is inextricably interlinked with that of the region and the continent. So I think these are some of the themes that I tease out in the book.
Would you be in favor of a universal basic income? And if you would you then be in favor of mostly removing the bureaucracy involved in the welfare sector? Just a blank check or a cash transfer to your account?
Yes, I am in support of a basic income grant, and I think that there's reasons beyond the current crisis, although the current crisis, I think, has really raised the bar on this one. One of the reasons is I think that as we enter this thing called the fourth industrial revolution, I think we're going to see that long-term careers are going to give way to periods of work followed by periods without work, periods of self-employment followed by something else. I think it's a much more, a very different working life that many people will undergo, and that I think that there's a growing movement and recognition that in order to make that transition a smoother one, we need to provide some level of basic income support. And then also you can claw this back for the richer people through the taxation system. So for administrative purposes, you pay everybody, but then that's part of your income, and you claw it back through the taxation system. So I think that is something very important. And I think that it would also mean that we could move away in some respects from these mean-tested benefits that we have now. I'm not sure that it would replace them all immediately. I think that some of them would have to continue to exist for the purposes that they have been developed in the first instance. But I think that there is when I spoke of poverty and inequality, it's been partly mitigated, and I think we should not forget this, by the social security system. We didn't have the social security system, we'd have many, many more people in much deeper levels of income poverty than we have now.
And lastly, I mean, this has been a very interesting conversation, but lastly, in the so-called right-wing circles, there's this term being bandied around, the National Democratic Revolution. And they like to quote Ramaphosa before, I think then he was the Secretary General of the ANC, that in order to take away white people's wealth, we have to do it slowly. And the National Democratic Revolution is sort of part of that. Is it really as scary as these so-called right-wing figures would want us to believe, or am I missing something?
Well, I think clearly less scary than some of the right-wing figures would want people to believe. But I think the essence of the National Democratic Revolution is that what needs to happen is we need to create a society in which we move away from exclusive privileges by a few defined by race into a society in which there's non-racialism. And I think that one of the analyses that we have come up with is that this happened disproportionately in the political sphere, but much more in the political sphere than it did in the economic sphere. So that there is still a need in the economy for a transformation of the economy such that I think various things need to happen. I think one of the fundamental ones I've already talked about, we need to industrialize and strengthen our incomes for all of our people in the country. But also at the same time, we need to ensure that the leadership of the economy does reflect the demographics of our society. We can't, we're now 25 years after political freedom. We still find that many of the top leadership positions of our private sector are in the hands of the same minority that occupied them for many, many decades and centuries before that. That needs to change. Needs to change in ways, I think, that give real broad-based benefits to people, not allow just people to use political connectedness to become fronts for somebody else, but actually allow real participation in the economy. I think all of these things are part of creating a national democratic society in which eventually there is non-racialism. But to achieve non-racialism, we've got to recognize that racialized privilege and racialized disadvantage still exist in our country, and we've got to address that front on.
And you attribute this inequality based on policy, not the ANC's, what these right-wing figures would say is incompetence.
I think that unemployment has quite a long history in South Africa. South Africa grew up or emerged as a significant colonial outpost in the mining revolution of the gold mining industry. The gold mining industry drew into low-skilled, low-paid employment many hundreds of thousands of people, not just from South Africa, but also from neighboring countries. Well, the gold mining industry passed its peak in the 1970s. And since then has been in decline, and the numbers in employment have been reduced all the way through. Many of those people have not found alternative jobs, and they were originally stuck in Bantustans. Now they've come into cities and towns, and we have a legacy of many low-skilled people who cannot find employment. We've got structural unemployment in South Africa, not cyclical unemployment. When the economy does well, it goes down a bit. When the economy does badly, it hits the extremes that we've got at the moment. And I think that we've really got to transform the productive base of the country. That's what I keep saying. We've got to move into higher value-added activities. We cannot any longer be a simple producer of mining commodities. We've actually got to add value to those mining commodities that we have inside the country and create jobs in our country, as well as other jobs through the industrialization, which I think is critical to the future of South Africa.
Well, thank you, Rob. This has been really a fascinating discussion. I want to give you a last moment to add, plug, or say anything that you want to do.
Well, I don't have very much to say. I'm just, I have in my book, offering an historical record. I'm passing down to a next generation my understanding of what has gone in the recent past, I guess motivated by the idea that those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So I think that hopefully people will find something of interest in the book that I've just finished.
Well, I would add to that I've skimmed through the pages through some chapters, like I said in the beginning. It was very fascinating, and I would recommend any person to read and buy Rob's book. And I thank you so much for joining us here on WorldView. If you liked our content so far, please consider subscribing, and sharing our videos. Until our next WorldView.